Brilliant. Okay, so voting and consensus is what we're talking about today. So basically reaching decisions. How do we get to the end result of a decision? A bit about PB, which you all know now, hopefully. So a little bit about deliberation, and we'll go into that more next week, the week after next week. So deliberative PB process, so how you can get to the end of a deliberative PB process. So a deliberative PB is primarily thought of as deliberation to make the final decisions. So this can apply to one or more phases where decisions need to be made depending on the design of the PB. So we did a little bit of an exercise last week with the idea generation. So having a sort of deliberative conversation, getting into discussions and making a decision about which ideas should go forward, which themes. So an example of that was Antwerp. So they used deliberation and consensus in 3 of their phases to decide on themes to be chosen, the money to be distributed, and then ultimately the final projects to be selected. So sometimes projects, when they're selected, that could be a final vote. But what they did was they used consensus and deliberation to get to that end result. So usually deliberations take place in small groups. So things like mini publics, citizen panels, but dividing up the groups. And then a decision is then made within this small group. So this could be made on, either majority votes or consensus. So discussing in the group and getting to that final conclusion. And the results of these different small groups together form the final decision. So you might have 10 small groups of 8 people, and then all of that gets collated together, and then that forms the final decision. So benefits of this sort of method, people from different backgrounds will learn from each other's different points of view, so their lived experiences, and then ultimately decide together what's important in their city. And it's really important to note that PB, that's around, deliberative PB, is a more difficult process for both participants and you, whoever's running the process. So for many people who are coming along and doing it, it can be a big step to come to a deliberative meeting. So much more so than just, clicking online and doing a quick vote of some sort. However, it's a democratic experience which is richer. So they're getting these conversations that are a little bit more qualitative. They need to make time and be willing to talk to people they don't know about what is important to them in their city. So it can be a bit daunting, if people aren't, familiar with talking to strangers or going into a group. It can be a little bit, what am I doing here? So that confidence building needs to be put in place. Yeah, so it's therefore really important to have trained facilitators guide participants into that process and also prepare them into the process. So what is actually going to happen, expectations, how long do I need to be there for, when's my lunch break, all that kind of stuff. So consensus is basically a general agreement of some sort, and the use of consensus and deliberation, it needs to be substantial enough that it's impacting the outcome of the decision. So you're asking people to engage in quite an intense process. So sometimes it might be multiple weekends or multiple events that you're running to get to a conclusion of some sort. So it has to be meaningful. You have to tell them, this ultimate decision will influence something, or it will go to a final vote, but you're having an impact. So otherwise, having all these sort of conversations is a bit meaningless. So yeah, just letting people know the importance of their outcome and their decision and the impact that they're making. So this is quite an interesting one, consent versus consensus. So I think in Scotland we tend to use the word consensus a lot, but sometimes we mean consent, and they're slightly differing, even though we sort of want to get to the same conclusion, everyone's sort of in agreement. They might have had these discussions and things like that. So consent is, we accept this decision. So it might not be their top priority, it might not be, what they might not love it, but they'll live with it. So it's the absence of objections. So people have given permission to this solution, even if it's not their first choice. And then consensus is, you've gotten to a point where actually everyone agrees. So it might be, a bit of a longer process where you're going through weekends, multiple events, and getting people to think of trade-offs and compromise. So what ifs, well, if we don't do that, what about this? And it can be over a longer period, and having multiple discussions and getting to them to that point. So consent is quicker than consensus. And it avoids that sort of deliberating until a meaningless compromise is reached. So you can sort of get to a point where you're making clearer choices. You want people to sort of be like, yes, I accept this decision, even though I don't love it. So it's slightly two differing, and they both got different purposes depending on the design and what you want to achieve with your process. But either way, so if you do a sort of consensus-based or a consent, it doesn't really matter. It's prepare people and explicitly tell them that the main goal is to reach agreement. So they have to listen to each other, and it's not just about them pushing their own ideas, because that can end up happening in PB. Everyone comes with their own ideas, their own experiences. But actually, if you tell them that the aim of this session is to listen to each other, and ultimately we want to all reach an agreement at the end of the day. So expectation setting is really crucial to get them in this sort of listening mode. So tell them the goal for the day. We want to reach an agreement. We want to get to this point. And then they've got that sort of in the back of their heads when they are getting into discussions with each other. So Sophie touched on this morning, but just a little bit about inclusive and designing consensus and decision making to be inclusive. So yeah, PB and deliberative processes shouldn't assume to be inclusive and free from power dynamics by default. An inclusive deliberative design should be concerned with a sort of series or set of criteria to ensure that equal opportunity of underrepresented people can be involved. And this is to enable things like access, to have equal opportunities to speak, and the equal use of that opportunity as well. So, for example, sometimes people only focus on descriptive representation of the group. So it might be like, okay, we've got 50% women, 50% men. So it might be that's the focus, when actually, in fact, you might want to sort of look at things like speech participation and whether people are having the sort of ability and confidence to speak and share their views. So that can be quite an important thing to evaluate the impact of that. Things like perceived influence of underrepresented groups in the process as well. So what influence are they actually having? So things like evaluation surveys and having space for that discussion as well with them should be considered. So practically, this is probably touching on this morning as well, but when it comes to decision making, things like providing information in advance, confidence building and explaining the process to set expectations for people, things like inclusive language, framing the right questions, using a thing such as conversation guidelines. So you can actually ask your group themselves to set their own rules and guidelines. So, if one person's speaking, everyone else should respect that person that's speaking, that kind of thing. Things like facilitation, going around the group individually and asking everyone, or having multiple options. So things like reading, facilitators reading things out, or verbal or written methods where people can communicate in different ways if they struggle with confidence. Things like breaks to account for space. So if they're getting to that point where they're about to reach a decision, but they just haven't had that breathing room to really process what's happened and what they've heard, that can be quite important. One, so they've got the space to think about that final decision, but also two, so that they can flag concerns. So if they feel like they're not getting their views across to people in the group, they can also flag that to the facilitator or a support person during the breaks as well. Yeah, and again, it's just some expectation setting. So these are just some top tips if you're doing a sort of deliberative or consensus process. So just making it very clear what's their influence over the outcomes. They've got access to information, inclusion of voice, so briefing facilitators so they know. Also about the participants in their group. So if there is any access needs or worries or concerns, how you might manage that and deal with that so that they know how to include these minority voices. And this is quite an interesting one, is where possible. So if you are doing a consensus-based approach to decision making, don't say to the group at the start of the event, if we can't reach consensus, there will be a vote. Because what happens then is people will go, okay, well, it doesn't matter because there's going to be a vote. And that kind of defeats the purpose of having these discussions and getting them to listen to each other's lived experience. So what you could do is, if participants themselves in the group call for a vote, so if they say, look, we're really struggling, we can't get to a point where we all agree, and if they say, can we just have a vote, that's them sort of pitching it to you, so you can go, okay. And it might be at that end point. So it's a little bit of a different narrative. But obviously, yeah, that consensus is really important for those discussions. But if they know a vote's coming up, they might not get into that meaningful discussion that they would otherwise have, basically. So we will go into this in more detail when we do facilitation training. But this is just some sort of tips when you're doing sort of consensus and you're trying to reach agreement with a group of people. So things, if you're stuck and you're just not, it's just not getting to a point of conclusion, you can ask participants to identify a priority each. So if you've got a wee small group and there's 8 of you, or there's 8 people in a group, you can ask them to individually identify their priority each. Check whether there are other options that participants feel very strongly about. Discuss those priorities, including what participants agree and disagree on, and then encourage participants to consider whether it's something they could live with, even if they don't necessarily love it. So we've got that sort of live with it, like it, love it. So it's like that balance. And then encourage participants to negotiate with each other. So instead of you sort of pitching all the questions to them, getting them to actually discuss with each other, these trade-offs and these priorities. Another thing is playing the conversation back to participants. So making sure if there's any possible points of consensus or agreement that may be coming through. So what I'm hearing is you all like this, but you're maybe not too sure on this. So how can we fix this problem? That type of thing. So another wee example, we've touched on this a wee bit before, but Antwerp. So they did small group consensus-based decision making. So 80% of the final decision was through consensus, and then they also had 20% of people doing an online vote as well. So that all kind of merged together as part of the final decision. I'm going to touch on voting very briefly, but I'd quite like us to get into an activity, so I won't go rambling on about this. But voting in PB is basically one of the means by which projects can be selected, or priority themes, so maybe that pre-phase before you do proposals, is decided on. And voting is currently the main approach used in PB decision making. So consensus or consent and deliberation isn't used as much. Although it's been sort of tested and it's been tried out a bit more, voting is usually the main approach that's used in PB. So there's lots of types of voting, and I'm going to not go into too much detail about this, but if you're interested in the sort of pros and cons of each, we can maybe get into a wee bit of a discussion after. And you might be familiar with these types of voting, you might have done them yourself as well, but single voting, so that's participants have a single vote to allocate for their favourite project, and then those projects with the largest number of votes, or yes votes, will get funded until the budget has run out. So the challenges with this are those, it can be quite easy to sort of persuade people to vote for a particular project, and therefore sort of rig the vote. So sometimes that's why people go, okay, well, let's have it so there's multiple votes. So this is basically the same thing. Each individual has multiple votes to distribute across the projects. So you could allow people to provide multiple votes to a single project, so it's got more, or multiple projects, so they can have maybe 5 votes that can distribute across. So this encourages people to think about how to distribute the votes and not just their favourite. So it's getting them to think about consensus and priorities, and looking at different projects that aren't their own or their own perceived interests and that kind of thing. So ranked voting, so this is ranking them from best to worst. So their favourite number 1, and then their least favourite maybe number 5. So it's often considered quite a fair approach because you're actually getting them to think of sort of compromising and prioritising their top to their least favourite and why, and getting them to think through reasonings why. But it can become quite complex if you've got more than 10 projects, because having to go through about 30 projects is a bit much, and people probably won't finish the process. So there's challenges and pros for each of these types. Positive and negative voting, so this is quite similar. Basically, participants are given a small number of positive votes to vote for projects, and then a smaller number of negative votes that of projects that shouldn't progress. So again, it's getting them to consider pros and cons for each proposal. So they're getting that. It's not just their favourite project. They're thinking about others' ideas as well. And similar to yes and no, that can be done quite similarly. You're just going yes, no, and it's quite simple for people to understand that one as well. Rating as well, quite similar to ranked voting. You can rate them 1 to 10, or yes or no. So rating's got that element to it as well. And then providing a budget or set number of points. So this can have benefits such as people can sort of understand money a little bit better and how money is spent and what things cost. Usually they'll just sort of allocate a vote or a set of money to each project until the money runs out, and then that's their vote complete. And then weighted voting can be used to sort of mitigate things like if you've got minority groups who aren't really getting their proposals through, you can actually use weighted voting. So, if you're from a specific postcode, or if you're a certain group of, from a group of people that are never getting their proposals through, you can actually say, right, you can have an extra vote for these types of projects, or you can have a boost vote if you're from this group or this postcode of people. So there's different ways you can do weighted voting as well. And then, of course, we've got paper ballot voting. So all of these types of votes could be done online or in person. And the key is obviously just to make sure that that's synchronous, whether you're doing it online or in person or a combination of both. It has to be synchronous with the method that you choose. So just to give you a little insight into what this looks like. So you've got the positive, negative voting there on the left. So you can sort of plus, so that's positive, and then minus, I don't want that. And then ranked voting, quite similarly, you can sort of, do a sort of number. Yes, I like it, 1 to 5. But as mentioned, doing that for about, any more than 10 projects, people can get tired and bored and they won't want to finish their vote. So just a little thing to remember if you're doing that type of voting. And this is also the budget. So if you're wanting to do sort of, you've got a set amount of money and you want people to understand how money is used and what things cost in your local area, you could use a sort of a budget and get them to actually go, okay, I've got this pot and this pot, and their vote kind of goes down, so the budget money goes down until they've spent it all. Yeah, so there's lots of things to consider when you're doing a sort of voting design and what you want to include. So things like, would you like users to have one vote to allocate across all projects, or multiple votes to distribute between different projects? Can users vote for the same project multiple times? That kind of thing. So that could be a boost vote that you're considering there, but it might just be for a certain group of people that are having the boost vote. So how are you going to manage that? How are you going to verify that that's who they say they are? That kind of thing. Would you like to weight votes towards either online or offline? So maybe people who come to an in-person event and they do a bit of deliberation and they've got that final vote, do they get a higher weighted vote? So is it, their vote means more than an online vote? So these types of things you might want to consider as well. And then also things like dividing the vote into specific areas or localities. So it might be only people within a specific postcode can vote on this group of projects, or a system where it's, a regional vote. So it's actually for quite large scale services and proposals. And then they might also have 2 local community or neighbourhood votes as well. So it might be you have more than one proposal or PB process going on at one time, but they're just synchronous with each other. And then thinking through things like themes. So if it's about environment or education or housing, how could these themes be divided into various individual categories to make it easier for people to understand what they're looking through, and why they're voting, and what is this for? What do I need to understand about this? Another important thing to note about this is if you're doing an online vote specifically, sometimes you can allow it in the back office that people can actually see votes coming in, so it's completely transparent and you can see which proposal has the top votes and which doesn't. So this can have sort of positives and negatives depending on how you want this, whether you want it to be fully transparent or you want that to be a sort of announcement of the winning proposals at the end. It really just depends on what you prefer. There's no single right voting system. It's just very important not to overcomplicate it and explain very clearly what you're doing and why. So maybe even explaining to people the method behind why you've done it this way, especially if you're doing things like weighted voting or specific postcode voting. So why is it only that area that are getting to do it and not this postcode, for example? And just making it very user-friendly for people. So if they need technical support, if you're doing an online vote, can you provide that? Or a phone call, getting them to have someone that can do the vote for them using iPads, or there's lots of options for sort of inclusion and making sure it's accessible as possible to people. Yeah, so these are just some examples. You might want to think about how you can make it easy to quickly count the votes and ensure the results can be independently verified. So it's not just you, the local authority, that are counting the votes, but someone else might come in and do it, just to make sure that it's that independent body. There's that transparency and accountability. Can you recount the votes as well? Is there a way that you can do that just in case something goes wrong? And then how can you ensure that you're accurately counting every person's vote and only allowing each person to register their vote once, whilst allowing privacy, so they're not having to provide lots of information about where they live and everything else. Maybe it's just their email address if they've got an email, and then their postcode, or a sort of user number if they don't have an email address. And then how can you make it difficult to hack and put people off trying to game it, but at the same time be accessible? So it's that balance that you're trying to reach when it comes to these sort of votes and designing the vote. But I'm going to stop there because I'll just check the time. We'll go into a little bit of a consensus exercise. So I don't know if every online event. Oh, we don't need to record if you don't want. Sorry, it's up to you. So it's in an online event. If you wanted to sort of come to the conclusion of something, maybe you've ran your consensus actually, but you can't reach that final point. So they're actually just different methods of voting. So I'm just going to see if I can find them all. Here we go. Right, I'll screen share this one first with you, just because it's we've done this before, but it's familiar, hopefully. So remember the your priorities. So you mentioned you can sort of up and down projects. So it could be a pre-phase selection. It's a type of voting essentially. But if I clicked on children's water sports, you can see people have sort of done a little bit of points for and points against. So it is a little bit of consensus, but it's on an online platform, so it's just slightly differently. You're not having the conversation, but it could be the basis for a conversation actually. So you could use it and go, okay, so people have already said this. Do I agree with that or do I not agree with that? So you can sort of, yeah, I agree. So you can do a one-time login actually, but and like it and things like that. So there's ways of doing a sort of pre-vote as such. I'm going to share this one with you. So this is Mentimeter. I can see people, yeah, most of you have used it before. This can be used in online events. It's quite similar to Slido, which we've used in the idea generation. So you can just do a quick vote in an event. I'll share the link with you in the chat. And I'll just get you to click on it and you can have a wee look at the different types of voting that there are in it. So we've got, it's a slide scale actually. So depending on how much you want to put money on it, you can drag it. So yes, I agree because it's got lots of impact, or yes, I agree because it's really fun for the group. So yeah. And it's also got the option to skip. So if you actually didn't want to vote for something, you can skip it, and then whoever's organising it can see why you skipped that type of thing. So, but you can turn on and off those options. And then once you've done your slide scale, you just click submit at the bottom of it. So everyone managed to get onto it, actually. It might not submit just because it's an old template, but have you managed to access it? Okay. Brilliant. Okay, I'm gonna show you this other tool, because this one's got different methods as well that you can use. So we touched on sort of ranked voting, rating voting, budget, and you can do this on SurveyMonkey. So I think it's a free tool, or it might have a small cost to it. But again, it's one of these tools that you can use in an online event, or an event if you're wanting to do something like that at the end of your session. So I'm just going to screen share this one with you. So again, welcome to the Whoville community vote. That's our mayor there, Mr. Whoville. So you've got £60,000, woohoo! So weighted score. So this is just it's a mock example really, just to show you the different types of voting you can do. So you've got weighted, so no, this project should not be funded, or yes, absolutely should be. You could do 5 points. And it's got the wee budget beside it as well. So average score, so it's similar to average weighted score, so you could just add up the total number of points each idea receives. So if you wanted to do it for each one, and then you could do an average calculation. So that involves a little bit more maths, but it could involve any number, so you could actually just add a budget. So if you wanted to change the way you design it, it could just be a budget. So kayak storage facilities for Whoville residents, yes or no, so you can do a bit of a slider. Ranking, so this takes a little bit more time, but it's getting the people to look through each project, and they have to vote for each project. It's not just one. So you can make it so that it's enforced, so they can't submit until they've completed each project, or it's optional. So if they can't decide on one, you could just have another option there. So yeah, so 1 point is your least favourite. 5 is your or 5 is your top favourite, so you can rank it like that. Multiple choice. So this is quite familiar to people. Select your top 3 projects. So you just click, yeah, I want that, and that's it. So it's getting people again to read through all the projects, make sure that they've picked more than one as well. So if it's just pick your top one, they might just pick for their own project. So having that extra couple of options, make sure that they read through all the other ones. Ballot. So this below, the framing might not look like a typical approach to a PB ballot, but it's used in other processes like citizens' assemblies. So you can do it in 2 ways, either as a matrix table, so this one here, where each option is given points between 0 to 3, which can be added at the end, so it has to be added up again, or by adding up the percentage of support from voting participants, so that's option 2 here. So if everyone agrees, and you add that up at the end. So you do have to have a bit of back office admin, someone that can do maths in the background. Then you've got that sort of presentation at the end. But what I'll do is I'll share this with you just so you can have a wee, test, and then see which one's your favourite as well.